Leave no one behind has become the defining promise of the Sustainable Development Agenda, positioning inclusion as a universal solution to poverty and marginalization. Yet, as far right and authoritarian state practices intensify state centric frameworks of citizenship, development, and nationality, continue to reproduce colonial logics of homogenization, monoculturalization, and exclusion across the global south and global north states. Communities challenging the very foundations of capitalist development, patriarchy, domination over nature and women, singular identities, imperialism, and internal colonialism are increasingly being marginalized by the very state structures claiming to mitigate climate change under the Paris Agreement. This raises a critical question. Is it enough for the degrowth movement to overthrow the ideology and objective of economic growth while retaining the same international norm based global order? Do the languages of development and inclusion into modern settler colonial states risk reproducing global colonial violence built on the murder and erasure of indigenous peoples, indigenous ecological knowledges, and ethnic minorities? Welcome everyone to episode 9 of the Sufficiency and Wellbeing Experience. Also seems like today it's the women of color experience. So anyway, myself, Nairita Roy Chaudhuri, also the co-editor of the Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine, and I also run my own YouTube channel called Planet Decolonized. So in today's talk show, we will discuss the politics of degrowth, development, citizenship, and inclusion in the global south. We have with us a very special guest, my dear friend and comrade, Maria Jose Recalde-Vela, who is an Ecuadorian Honduran PhD candidate at the Department of Public Law and Governance at Tilburg Law School, Tilburg University in the Netherlands. She investigates the manner in which inclusion as a concept is conceptualized, imagined in the field of statelessness through the practice of human rights and international development actors. She is interested in questions of inclusion, nationality, citizenship, statelessness, and decolonial approaches to development based on Andean philosophy and knowledge. We also have with us Gisela Ruiseco, co-editor of our magazine Sufficiency and Wellbeing, which you guys must totally check out. Gisela writes on environmental and decolonial topics. So coming back to the open-ended discussion, and please feel free to jump in, Maria. My general question for today is, can you explain for the ordinary and the imaginary audience who is watching us today what decoloniality means and how is it different from decolonization? And the reason I ask this question is because many people still think that European colonization is over and that all countries are sovereign and free. Is it different from imperialism and post-colonialism?
Thank you so much for the invitation, Nairita. I'm really excited to be here and just to talk a little bit about these really important and very timely topics at the moment. And also, I know that the topic about elections that we will also have in this session are also relevant for my own home country. Actually, for both of my home countries, we recently had an election in Honduras that was very controversial. And it's now pushed the country back to the far right. And in Ecuador at the moment, unfortunately, we also have a very authoritarian government. We're really shifting to authoritarianism, in my opinion, and that's quite concerning. But back to your question about the difference between coloniality and decolonization and the process of colonialism per se. So sometimes they are kind of conflated. And you see that as well in scholarship, where people are, for example, doing a historical analysis and they're talking about the process of decolonization. And sometimes people assume that it's just something that happened in the past and that it's over because most of the world is now effectively sovereign, which is actually not entirely true. There are still colonies, like places that are still under the control of a foreign power, like Puerto Rico is a prime example of that. There are many, France also has a lot of overseas territories that are, technically still colonies, and a few other parts of the world, especially small islands. So decolonization is not entirely over in that sense. And as well, within a lot of post-colonial states, quote unquote, there is still that people who were colonized are still not in charge of their own lands, as we see in the US, for instance, or across Latin America, where indigenous people don't have full sovereignty over their territories, the territories that belong to them for centuries. But I think it's also important to make then the distinction between coloniality, decoloniality, and post-colonialism, because I think I mean, to me, decolonization and colonization is more the political process. It is a historical political process that took place. And there were, of course, struggles for independence and to get rid of the colonial powers. But what decolonial scholars argue is that the structures of colonialism remained embedded in the societies that were colonized. A lot of that was kind of inherited by the groups of power that inherited after colonialism was over. I mean, Gisela, you might agree or maybe disagree with me that in Latin America, a lot of the power stayed with the elites that were, many of us were white mestizos who had power, whose ancestry also came from Spain, sometimes came with the government and eventually rebelled against the crown, but that the power did not shift to the hands of, for example, indigenous people in the countries. It shifted to the local elites that wanted more sovereignty for themselves, but not necessarily for the rest of the population. And I think, I mean, from a scholarly perspective, to me, decoloniality really is a tool for analyzing power. I think that's one thing that many people get wrong, that it is not just about looking at the historical political process, but it is about looking at power in the present and tying it back to those structures that were set up after 1492. So racism, it is one of the many tentacles of coloniality. So is the patriarchy, so is capitalism, so is extractivism. It's these structures of power, and I think that's the importance of coloniality as a concept for analysis. And I think it's important not to conflate the two, and people tend to do that. I think the one example I can think of where it was decolonization and decoloniality was the Haitian Revolution, a very overlooked historical event where it was a group of enslaved people who rose up against France. And the way that they kind of, the discourse that they adopted and the ideas that they presented, it was really breaking within the existing structures of power, in the sense of they were for the eradication of slavery, of course, which kind of broke that that power that European powers had granted themselves by saying that Black people were not human. And the Haitian Revolution said, actually, we are all free, we are all equal, we are all human. And that was also kind of going against the French Revolution's idea of the universal citizen, which was the white man who owned property. And so it was like excluding women, excluding people in the colonies, and especially excluding enslaved persons. So the Haitian Revolution, in that sense, was decolonization because they expelled the foreign imperial power. But it was also, to me, an expression of decoloniality because it really challenged the essence of that colonial power, not just in terms of political might, but also like the racial structure that permitted that power to exploit and abuse an entire island of people.
So, what you're trying to say is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that despite the fact that European colonization was formally over or not in certain countries, the structures remained, and they were inherited by the local and national elites, which is why and for also like the racial structures you mentioned, such as dehumanization of the Black peoples, even in the global South. Can you give me an example of the ongoing dehumanization of the Black people in the Latin American context for the audience?
I'm pretty sure Gisela will probably have some examples from Colombia. I mean, Colombia has a very strong history of Afro-Colombian resistance and people claiming spaces, claiming their rights. Within my doctoral research, I looked at the Dominican Republic, and I think it is a very harsh example of extreme racism and the complete rejection of African identity, of the identity of people of African descent. So in the Dominican Republic, this might get me in trouble, but I mean, the Dominican government does not acknowledge that they created over 200,000 cases of statelessness in the country by denying the children of Haitian migrants Dominican citizenship. They had a court ruling in 2013 that retroactively stripped hundreds of thousands of people who had been born in the Dominican Republic, who were Dominicans by birth, just because in the Dominican Republic you could be a citizen just by being born in the territory. The Constitutional Court interpreted the Constitution as excluding the children of irregular migrants by saying that they were in transit, which is a ridiculous interpretation because you could never claim that somebody who's been living in a country for sometimes 2-3 generations is in transit. But they decided that all the children of Haitian migrants or grandchildren of Haitian migrants were born to regular parents who were in transit, and so they applied this retroactively. So it stripped hundreds of thousands of people of their Dominican citizenship. But this is not an isolated case. This really came. I really had to excavate that during my research. It came with decades and decades and decades of tensions between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There is a long history of. It starts from the colonization of the island, later moving into the processes of decolonization. Haiti actually invaded the Dominican side to free enslaved people because the island was split in two between France and Spain. The French side, which was called Saint-Domingue, they rebelled against France. That was the Haitian Revolution. And eventually they became free. But on the Spanish side, Santo Domingo, people were still enslaved. So at some point, Haiti invaded to free people from slavery. And then, I mean, the Spanish side had its own sort of Hispanic identity, or we're developing that difference with the French-speaking side. It's a much more complicated history, and I'm kind of messing it up a bit. But over time, the tensions continued. Also, during the dictatorship by Trujillo, there was a massacre. So there's always been tension along this border. And of course, with the sugar cane plantations, which is what the island was especially rich for, like the main product that was exported actually from the island towards Europe was sugarcane. For all the tea salons in fancy Paris and Madrid and all the European capitals, a lot of that was sugar coming from the Hispaniola island. And so after decolonization, after Spain and France were no longer in control of the territory, the sugarcane producers continued. It just passed to different hands, to the hands of the local elites. And especially on the Spanish side, it attracted a lot of migration from Haiti. So that is how a lot of Haitian migrants ended up settling effectively in the Dominican side and being born there. So over time, of course, because of these tensions and this rejection of the Haitian Revolution and the history of that side of the island, because it was, I mean, the Haitian Revolution was quite terrifying for a lot of the colonial and post-colonial states in the region. It was terrifying for the entire world that just a small group of slaves could really have a full revolt and overthrow a colonial power.
Yeah.
Like it terrified people in the southern U.S. and I think in other parts
and
of Latin
ignored. And
And
the
what?
aftermath completely ignored that it
Yeah.
actually had happened very early in history.
Yes,
It could actually
Exactly.
was totally obscure that they were actually the first ones to
it's
rebel.
still not taught in schools widely. And to me, it is one of the most groundbreaking historical events in humanity's entire history that enslaved people could rebel and overthrow a colonial power. Like that is something that should be taught in every school around the world. And yet we're told about World War I and World War II endlessly. We never hear about the
Yeah,
Haitian
as
Revolution.
the
It's
starting
something-
point of the reference.
Yeah,
Yeah, like World War
it's
One.
just insane. But anyway,
Yeah.
so the tensions continued in the island. Of course, there was migration, and over time, the Dominican authorities found different ways to kind of exclude this population that did not fit within their view of what the Dominican identity is, because they are Black. They are of African descent, and Dominicans do not consider themselves to be of African descent, even though many of them have African ancestors. They consider themselves more Hispanic. So that creates that tension in the island, that rejection, and eventually that was kind of cemented through a constitutional court ruling. But in terms of administrative practices, that exclusion had been happening for decades. That's also why a lot of these communities have been living without documents for many generations. That's also why it was quite easy for the authorities eventually to kind of completely lock some people out, because their parents and their grandparents never had documents that they could prove that they had been living in the country for a very long time. So that's, I think, a very salient example. And of course, there are other things as well in the administrative structures of the Dominican Republic that are shockingly racist, actually. And some of them have had to change. They went to the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination, and were slapped a little bit for some of the other practices that they implemented.
I'm curious to hear, Gisela, your thoughts on the Colombian perspective of decoloniality. What do you understand by decoloniality in terms of the post-colonial era? Like, do you see a difference?
Well, I would like to dock into the last thing Maria said, because I think it's not only structures that stay after colonialism; it's ways of understanding oneself. And the thing is, the people consider them, we are all mixtures. Most of us are mixtures. But I'm going to tell another story about Black people regaining their identity as a positive contrast to what Maria has said. Because in Colombia, we have a really great constitution from 1991, where the indigenous peoples and the minorities, people who are really still living like indigenous, it's only like 5% in Colombia. It's really, really a small quantity. Most people are mixed mestizos, and Black people are like 10%. But Black people, since they were not living there, they don't have a, they do have an ancestral territory, but they didn't really recognize it as such. But there's a really nice story in a book from Arturo Escobar where he tells how this Black identity was actually regained and formed, and it happened through how do you call it, alphabetization campaigns, where students and people from the city went to the Pacific coast where many Black people live and did the alphabetization campaigns by letting them explain their roots, their customs of the Black people. And in a very slow process, the Black people in the Pacific coast of Colombia, where our vice minister now comes from, which elections are coming up, and that's the next theme. So it was really a formation of identity where they actually realize their identity hangs very much upon rivers, which is like a completely new idea of belonging to the land. So this is a really positive development, which Colombia, even though it is such a right country and the elites are so successful in having established themselves with no
By right, do you
contestation.
mean in the right political spectrum? Okay.
Yes, completely. So yes, I leave this by side and go now. There's an article coming. There's elections in Colombia on the 30th. There's an article in our magazine so people can read it, where I'm not talking about the elections results because they won't be there yet. But I'm going to talk about this, how the elites have been incredibly successful in staying in power to the degree that the left had not ruled until now, until Petro. And this is a very complex historic, many reasons. You can't really land that down. Why in Colombia? Why is this like this in Colombia? Because it has many reasons. But in the article, I will give more details. Talking about citizenship, I think the criollos who took the power from the Spanish people were very successful in staying in power under the same structures and declaring themselves as taking their country to civilization. This then later docked into the development discourse, which Arturo Escobar has also developed. It only started actually in the 50s. But before that, we have the civilizatory discourse, where the criollos really saw themselves as taking the country to civilization. And the resulting definition of citizenship, I say this, Maria, because I find it very interesting what you're doing about citizenship, because the side of this in the 19th century, races could be completely ignored, even though they were sitting on the table like a gorilla, you could say. Race could be completely ignored. Everybody was a citizen. But of course, the power relationships were there. And this is where I also agree with Maria. Power relationships is what has been brought to the discussion by decolonial authors. Power relationships is something that's completely obscured in capitalism. Markets are supposed to work in an area with no power relations, which is completely unreal. So this is very important what the decolonial authors have brought to realize the power relationship in the narrations we say about ourselves. My interest in this theme started when I was very little, and I asked myself, why does my grandmother take me to a shop and ask people if they have anything from the US? Because Colombian things are not good.
Okay. The same thing happens in India
It
as
starts
well.
there.
Like, I want to like quickly jump in this conversation because I mean, I think 2 months back I was in Goa with my parents, and then my mother wanted to buy a Kashmiri shawl, and this shopkeeper was like, "This is what the Europeans like. You can buy this." And my mother is like, "This is going from Kashmir, which is a questionable part, whether it's an integral part of India or not. It's occupied. This entire thing of like the European choices, like dominating the customers' choices in India, that being the enticing factor to sell commodities is another colonial artifact, like the cultural artifact, rather. Yeah.
Mhm.
Gisela,
Yes.
for the international audience, could you define what you understand by the criollos?
Yeah, the conflict that led to independence from Spain was actually that the criollos, who were the descendants of Spanish
Like
people.
Simón Bolívar, he is basically the
Yeah, he
face.
was a criollo. He was a very
Yes.
rich criollo from a very important family in
Yes.
Caracas. They actually were unhappy with the Spanish people born in the peninsula, born in Europe. With them, of course, Ecuador and Colombia are sister countries. We have the same history. So that's the criollos. But they actually wanted the power for themselves. They used the brown people to fight the Spaniards, but then they just kept the same structures and the same understanding of who's civilized and who is uncivilized.
I want to add that Haiti helped Bolivar. Haiti sent arms, they sent fighters, and the promise was that slavery would end because, I mean, for Louverture and for Jean-Jacques Dessalines, their passion was, I think their cause was really ending slavery. It's just such a disgusting institution. Slavery is the worst thing we've ever done. And for them, it was really about ending slavery everywhere. And so, from what I understand, Bolivar had kind of almost agreed to, probably historians can correct me, but there was an agreement that slavery would end, and it really didn't. So, one could say that the South American revolutions actually betrayed the promise that they had made to Haiti because of in exchange of Haiti's help for independence.
And yeah, so the criollos kept the power, and in Colombia they kept the land structure. The land structure is still from colonies. I don't know how it is in Ecuador, but the really long war in Colombia, which actually has never stopped, which stopped in really short times, it comes because of the land structure, because of one of the most unequal land tenancy in the world. Colombia has not been able to do a land reform.
That's the
It's
same.
still like from the Middle Ages almost.
Same in India.
And in Ecuador, the church, I don't know if in Colombia the church also had a lot of influence, but I mean, at least after decolonization, the church still retained a lot of the land ownership, and a lot of indigenous people and people of African descent continued to live in basically maybe not full slavery like legally, but in fact, they were enslaved. They had no way out. We had this system called Huasipungo that was basically a form of slavery. I mean, people were renting land, they were not getting paid for their work, and their payment was being able to farm a small piece of land that belonged to the landowner, and they still had to give part of the crop to the big hacienda owner. So it was a form of slavery. So in Ecuador, eventually we had the liberal revolution with Eloy Alfaro that changed a lot of things. Indigenous people joined that. And I think one thing that's somewhat redeemed Ecuador, and it's still a constant struggle, has been that we have a very strong indigenous movement who have been fighting throughout history. There have been revolts throughout history. They have been claiming rights. They have been really mobilizing. There were massacres, and they have not stopped. So we have Conaye, which was formalized
so claiming
over the
rights
20th century.
to the ancestral lands or claiming rights as citizenship?
In general, I mean, they had basically no rights. Even after decolonization, the situation didn't really change for them. It just got better for the Criollo elites.
Okay.
So their rights claims have been quite expansive. Right to have control over their ancestral territories, but also rights as full citizens who are part of society. So some of that did take place with Alfaro's liberal revolution, which was in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was eventually murdered, and some of his reforms were taken back. But he took away a lot of the power from the church, because the Catholic Church really was, I think, the biggest landowner in Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken. And the church always pulled the strings behind the scenes. So he stripped. The church was the Catholic Church.
And the church, is it still as important? Is the state
No.
more important than the church, or the church is? Okay.
No, Alfaro's revolution stripped some of the power from the church.
Okay.
And I think over time, I mean, the church is important as an institution, but no longer as influential politically, and in terms of land ownership, not anymore. But yeah, the struggle of indigenous people continues. And so over time, and I think Ecuador is an interesting example because we, in 2008, with the 2007 constitution, we became a plurinational and intercultural state. And so our constitution formally recognizes that we are not, I mean, we're all Ecuadorians, but that we have different nations within the country. So we have the Quechua nation, the Amazon has a lot of different nations. It also recognizes the Montubio people and the Afro-Ecuadorian people. So we understand that we are not just one monocultural identity, but that we are many.
Yeah.
Of course, like in terms of the policies and the practical implementation of that has not been desirable, because we've had some political back and forths, and the swings to the right, that the right does not like this very much. Swings to the left, it's a little bit better. But the politics always complicates this vision, and that idea was in part presented by CONAIE and the indigenous movement, because the 2007 constitution, I mean, the recognition of the rights of nature and a lot of the really progressive ideas that came about in our 2007 constitution, it was the result of civil society movements. And it was really the indigenous movement of the country pushing for this to be included in the constitution. And they had been doing that for decades. So it's a very, very long struggle that they had been carrying out, that passed from generation to generation. Some of the great leaders, like Mama Dolores Cacuango, she never got to see, interculturality and plurinationality in a constitution. But she started, I think it was like in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, where she was pushing for the Quechua language to be taught in the schools, for indigenous children to learn in their own languages. And she was mobilizing politically. Many of them were politically persecuted. So it's been like a long struggle that's been passed on between several generations. And I think the struggle continues because extractivism is completely back.
Yeah.
Our current government wants to sack the country dry. So I think, unfortunately, you can have a great constitution, but you need the political will to implement it.
I want to sort of jump in the conversation that Gisela ended with. I think it's really important that you pointed out that one of the things that European colonization has done is how we understand ourselves, our identities, not just as individual, but also as collectives, how we relate to the land. And, what European colonization has done is it has completely severed human collective relationships with the land by making market as the center that can commodify everything. And that is rather violent. I mean, that is the post-colonial aftermath, the post-colonial identity that we are still living with. I think in the Indian context, most of the communities which challenge this identity are the Adivasis, or the indigenous communities, who want to integrate the land, the collective identity, water, forest, and all these relations together from a relational perspective. And that is something decoloniality can help. And a lot of decolonial authors are useful in sort of rewiring those identity crises. And I wanted to ask you, because we are only left with, I think, 4 to 5 minutes, but yeah,
no.
but we do have a second episode number 10, and where we can continue this conversation. So, Maria, you don't have to stress out. I mean,
I have too much to say.
I would also like to talk a bit about the Colombian elections.
yes, I think we can talk about that in the second half. One of the violent identities that also remain, in addition to how we relate to the land, is the monocultural aspect of the identity, like how nation states are completely, identities are forcefully homogenized, where everybody ought to have the same worldviews and relate to the world in the same ways. And that is another form of violence. For the audience and the listeners, I really want each of you all to quickly offer a key author or reference that people can look up to for understanding the key aspects of decoloniality.
I mean, I think a problem sometimes for international audiences is that some decolonial thinking has really been theorized from Latin America, and a lot of the writing was originally in Spanish. And I think for international audiences, sometimes it's good to just go to the translated versions of some works. I guess Walter Mignolo is probably one of the most mainstream ones, and I think he generally explains it in a way that a lot of people can understand, and like quite broadly. I think he was really building like the colonial theory quite broadly, because some other authors maybe go into specific topics. And I think just to get like a general sense of it, I think it is a good source. Like he's a good source. But there are, of course, other authors that have also written in Spanish and that have written on different themes that I think if you're interested in a more gendered perspective or a more environmental perspective, I think there are other people to look into.
Gisela, what
for
about
me,
you?
Arturo Escobar, who I have mentioned several times, has been one of the main authors during time. He gave another view of development.
Okay.
Escobar. He was very important for me in the beginning, and then in the last years, he has moved towards relationality. So this is really interesting, because from the critique to how we have been colonized to what where can we go to? How can
Hybrids.
we, what you said, Nairita, how do we find
Yeah.
again a relationality with our land? We who are criollos, actually, or who are mestizos, hybrids completely, who are we? This
Exactly.
question was also raised by Bolivar. What do we do now? Relationality is really important to develop, and another understanding of history. And this is where
The
Agnolo
worst
comes.
thing that colonialism and sometimes Eurocentrism has done to the world is pushing forward this idea of individualism, which I think I see a lot here in the West. Is like, I am an individual. It is about
Yep.
me and my life and my success. And if I have to step on top of other people, we see that in the US at the minute, like the whole tech billionaire fight, they are going to cannibalize each other, and they would be happy to destroy each other if they can come out on top. And it is just completely, the US was actually quite successful at kind of trying to break up communities. They sent, for example, missionaries to the Amazon to preach some of their doctrine, and that is very individualistic. It broke people apart from their social ties, from their connection to the land, because that makes it easier to extract.
We can talk about this in the second half, Maria, but I would just like to quickly end with a reference from the Indian perspective. So at least in India, when I was studying my master's in development studies, I actually read Arturo Escobar's work, and I was introduced to post-development and questioned the Western dependency and the Eurocentrism. So that was Arturo Escobar is very influential for Indian communities. In addition to that, Ashish Nandi's works on the colonial violence done to human identities was very influential in talking about how colonizations masculinized human identities and breaking away from traditional notions of gender roles and also traditional notions of understanding ourselves as embodying masculine as well as feminine aspects. So he delved into that complexities and how colonization damaged those identities of ourselves. So I think with that problematization of monocultural identities and colonial violence and violence done in terms of removing ourselves from land, for the audience, we would like to have this conversation in the second and uncensored half of this interesting ranting and conversations among women of color and people of the global south, pairing hybrid identities or mixed identities. I don't know whether it's an identity crisis or not. Let's figure that out in chapter 2, which is called as episode number 10. Until then, do check out our Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine, in addition to sharing and subscribing to this show among your other comrades. All right. Bye, everyone.